Okay, so this is the filter group progress report for SSPC 170. This presentation will be given on April 24th, 2017. The filter work group started in the fall 170 meeting. Our scope was to come up with a rational basis for assigning filter levels to healthcare spaces. This is our charter right here, essentially. Kickoff was October of last year. We've had 10 meetings. Average attendance at the meetings was about 10 people. We had a high of 19, and we've had a core of 11 people who've attended half or more of the meetings that we've had. And just to put the bottom line up front, these are the recommendations that we have at this progress point. First, to assign filter efficiencies based on this mass balance model. I'm going to show that model in a little bit here, and a picture is worth 1,000 words there. Two is to create performance pathways. We want to set up the standard for alternative approaches and incoming technology, essentially. And then finally, we really recommend that ASHRAE have a written rationale behind the filter assignments. We want to publish it, make it available to the members. We're recommending the work of this group be turned over to TC 9.6. Mike Matire has kind of volunteered to look for a vehicle for us to publish that. What's really happened is ASHRAE 170 is a mandatory minimum document, and you'll see that a lot of what we're uncovering really belongs in design guides and recommendations. So part of our scope was to review evidence, and we didn't do what I would call a scientific or comprehensive literature review. We didn't go into the databases and search for air filters and then read every paper. So the list of studies that we have are just the studies that we talked about or the ones that our members sent in. And there's 2 slides of this. We did share our list with Roger's team back in January, so they have all of this. And we've also reached out to Roger and Ferd for a few sidebars. We didn't want to miss any big stuff that that work group is finding, or vice versa, really. So we started our work with this survey, and hopefully some of you participated in this. We asked this big, honking sort of meaning of life question: why do we need filters in healthcare spaces? And this was all free text response. We had 52 responses to this survey. And that really told us what people were thinking about and what the important topics were. And no surprise, the biggest topic was infection control and the usual suspects of critical spaces. So we tried to hit infection control pretty head on. Dan Kay was able to get an infection preventionist to attend our meeting number 2. We had a really lively discussion with him. Another one of our members has been able to present a slide deck that we had from about 2 meetings ago to a room of infection preventionists, and that went pretty well as well. So I would love to say that what we've come up with is a bulletproof rationale based on clinical evidence, but the bad news is if you want to find clinical evidence for filters before the coil or after the coil, or like a MERV 10 versus MERV 13, you're not really going to find it. So much of what we would need for evidence-based decision making simply isn't there. So one of the things we've come up with is what I call the summary of the unknowns. And I'm going to go through that real fast. First off, there is no acceptable level of indoor particle count or particle matter. The EPA publishes PM for outdoor air, and most IAQ people sort of take that outdoor air number and bring it indoors. What we'd really like to see are separate numbers for healthy people versus people recovering from surgery, or sick people, or cancer patients, or that type of stuff. We don't have any of that. Second, what is true for particles is also true for bioaerosols. For bioaerosols, there's not even outdoor numbers. The WHO used to publish some indoor bioaerosol numbers in the 1980s, but they actually discontinued them, citing a lack of evidence. There's a paragraph or 2 in the ASHRAE handbooks about that. Third, particle levels in rooms are a function of a lot of variables. particle deposition, reentrainment, room airflow, mixing, filters, effectiveness, surface types, generation activity, etc., etc., etc. You can't really generalize those into nice, clean little boxes. The scope of this group was about filters, and so we tried to keep our discussions and our sort of boundaries limited to that. Fourth, we do not know any relationships between particle level or bioaerosol level and the most common types of sort of in-room infections like bloodstream or catheter. We do know that C. diff and staph can be in the air, but we have no idea what any of the relevant levels are. We did look at a document that we cite throughout here called the Compendium of Infection Control Strategies. It doesn't say anything about air. The closest you'll find is for C. diff and staph, environmental cleaning is recommended. And of course, air filters can be kind of a secondary contributor to environmental hygiene. But that's about as close as you ever come to, a statement by an infection prevention literature recommending filters. Fifth, internationally, everybody agrees that clean air in operating rooms is a means to reduce risk of surgical site infection. Unfortunately, we don't really know how clean is relevant. There's no known relationship between particle counts and infection rate. And so you're going to see some points later on from the international standards, and you will see that different countries have drawn that line in different places. Sixth, largely, there's the same story for protective environments. Everybody agrees that we should keep them clean, but nobody really knows how clean is clean. There is a number in this case, and the number is 1 colony forming unit per meter cubed. That has been suggested by the clinical literature, but even that is not really a tested or scientifically validated number. It's a recommendation of the clinical literature, and it's basically a measurement threshold. If you measure anything in the air, then that's considered to be unacceptable. And finally, we really don't know that upstream filters versus downstream filters or two-pass filters versus single-pass filters have any particular effects on health outcomes or patient care outcomes. So the list of the unknowns is quite a big list, which is to say that what we're going to be talking about moving forward from here is rational and logical. It's not really scientific or evidence-based per se. This is a bastardization of a figure from the beginning of Standard 62. And these are all the locations where you could have filters in an air system. A is at the outside air intake, B is at the mixing of the outside air and return air, C is after a coil but upstream of the duct, D is a terminal filter right at the room, then we have a makeup air filter, F is filtered exhaust, G is a recirculating air filter, H is a lint filter on a return grill, which we've actually heard of, and then I is a return filter that would happen prior to mixing. In the ASHRAE standards, ASHRAE Standard 62 only requires a filter at location B. Standard 170 has traditionally included talking about positions B and C, and in the standard they call those filter bank 1 and 2. Although C and D could be alternate locations of filter bank 2. There is a lot to talk about on this slide. We spent a whole session and a half talking about this. Upstream, downstream, 1 bank, 2 bank, terminal filters at the rooms, recirculation units, wet coils, dry coils, snow, pre-filters, preheat coils, hot climates, dry climates, UV at coils, heat exchangers. There's really a lot to discuss. And so the paper that I emailed out has a pretty decent sized section on this. And this, we're thinking, really needs to wind up being a section in a design guide rather than sort of covered in one small section in a standard. Okay, so the task that we're really up to here is to try to come up with recommendations for filters space by space. And we've come up with a couple lists of spaces. So you have a list of clean spaces, a list of exhausted spaces, and then a list of so-called, normal cleanliness spaces, and then, of course, different iterations of patient spaces. This is one area we want to get feedback on. We could spend more time on this list. Well, I think among our group, we want to spend more time on these lists. But I think we also want to hear some perspectives on sorting spaces for assessment, largely kind of in the absence of a lot of evidence. Okay, so that brings me to the mass balance model. We wanted to do some math, and so we wanted to have some sort of calculation to look at different configurations. So we built this model where we could look at the effects of different filter configurations and efficiencies. What we did was use a mass balance equation. You can find this equation in Standard 62, but really it's just a conservation of mass equation. The model is in units of annual average PM 2.5 because we have data on annual average PM 2.5 from weather stations. And then the rest of the variables in there are CFMs of supply and return and outdoor air and filter removal. The filter removal numbers that we used are for PM 2.5 come from this table. This was an EPA study, which was featured in the ASHRAE journal rather recently. So here's the chart of the model, and let me point out a whole bunch of things. First off, the x-axis is meaningless, and the y-axis is a logarithm. A lot of IAQ things are actually logarithms. In particular, the other logarithmic metric we've probably heard of is ISO 14644, the cleanroom classes, and you'll see those on this chart. It says, ISO 9 or ISO 8, ISO 7 in those bands. But I need to say that there is not really a conversion factor to get from a PM 2.5 number to an ISO class. This is an approximation based on some assumptions of particle diameter and density. So it's a rough converter, I would say. So let me point out some of the points. Some of the points that you see in the top in the middle are outside air. Those are in PM 2.5, and those are real numbers. They come from historical data, weather data stations. I will point out the Los Angeles number, which is 15 micrograms a cubic meter. That's the number that we used in the model for all of the modeled points. So on the left, the bottom left points are points from the literature or from other standards. So the Gormley study of ORs that came out this year had 3 points. Those are all down there. Then you'll see the points that come in from the international standards. They have points down there. And then down at the very bottom, one of the points that you'll see is the compounding hood in a USP 797 pharmacy. But the points that come from the model are all the points that sort of scale down the right, and they're the points with the stars next to them. So the first question you might ask is, hey, I only see points for 2 air changes per hour. What about 4 air changes or 6 air changes? And obviously, since it's a spreadsheet, we can run all the scenarios in the world. But we're thinking of the accuracy of this model being about a half an order of magnitude. And also on a logarithm chart, you kind of have to look for things that cause significant jumps. When you change a filter efficiency, that causes a jump. When you go from 2 air changes to 15 or 20 air changes, that causes a jump. Going from 2 air changes to 4 air changes, not so much. On a log chart, those points kind of wind up very close to each other. The other thing is, in order to run this model, you have to assume an indoor particle generation rate. And this model assumes 0 indoor particle generation rate, which means that this model, the modeled points over there, are showing an at-rest condition. That is less than ideal, and we tried some iterations where we plugged in indoor generation rates. That obviously shifts everything, but the data that we have on generation rates is really not very good. We have some data about humans generating particles in clean room environments, but we really don't have a whole lot of general information. So then what we did is we did some voting. We put this model up on the screen, we made some proposals, and we took some votes. And we used the 5-point scale. You see that down on the bottom left there. The 5-point scale was 1 is I hate it, 2 is I'm okay with it, but I have serious concerns, 3 is I'm okay with it, but I have some concerns, 4 is it's not perfect, but I mostly like it, and then 5 is I like it, right? So you kind of consider 3 as being, I'm okay with it, I have some concerns. And so what we would do is put a proposal out there and get a vote from everyone on the call. And then for anyone whose vote was a 3 or less, we would talk through their concerns. I'm going to read through these kind of quickly. There are 9 slides of these. So the first one, in spaces where the primary ventilation concern is exhaust, then supply air filtration doesn't need to be specified per se. You could use transfer air or even natural ventilation for supply. The vote on this was a 4.1. Next, any human-occupied space should meet the indoor air quality requirements of Standard 62. That would include filters on supply air. This vote was a 4.8. Now, I will point out that Standard 62 allows natural ventilation and that the filters in Standard 62 depend on outdoor air quality and that there's a whole bunch of equipment requirements that go along with Standard 62, and all those would carry over. Next, any patient space, inpatient or outpatient, where patients are staying for less than 2 hours, excluding waiting rooms and procedure rooms, can also use the Standard 62 rules. No additional filters are needed. That vote was a 4.5. Next, for out and inpatient spaces, up to and including a med surge, but not an ICU, we said they could use Standard 62 rules. No additional filters needed. That vote was a 3.2, which is not super strong. So next, for out and inpatient spaces, up to and including med surge, but not an ICU, you could use the Standard 62 rules with the added caveat that you have to have a MERV 14 somewhere in the system. Not a pre-filter, final filter per se, just a MERV 14 somewhere in there. That would still not exclude natural ventilation. That vote was a 4.7. The next, for operating rooms, the design target would be somewhere in the 0.013 to 0.13 microgram a cubic meter ISO 6 to ISO 7 range. That vote was a 4.3, and that should correspond to a normal operating room today. Next, for an OR that is for orthopedic or cleaner procedures, the design target should be an order of magnitude less, from 0.0013 to 0.013 microgram a cubic meter, or ISO 5 to ISO 6. That vote was a 4.3, which is pretty strong. California has this, so does France, Japan, the UK, but it's never been in 170. And the low vote concerns, by the way, had mostly to do with logistics, designating a room that's cleaner. And of course, bears repeating, I guess, that there's no evidence here, right? For protective environments. And I have to say, in order to even get this to a vote, we had to specify that these are designated, bona fide protective environment spaces where all the protocols of a protective environment space are at play. And we started by saying that the target would be in the ISO 5, ISO 6 neighborhood. That vote was 4.6. But then we actually realized that 12 air changes with a HEPA filter would be less than that. And so we have a proposal for a bona fide protective environment. The design target would be in the ISO 5 range and would in fact be intended to meet the 1 CFU per meter cubed clinical recommendation. This vote was a 3.8, and this, by the way, would line up with some of the international standards. And that's the last one. Those are all the spaces that we work through in terms of this roll call voting. And since this is a progress report, we're going to ask for feedback and some advice on next actions. Obviously, one thing we could do is keep going with this type of proposal and voting process to cover the rest of the spaces that we showed earlier. So we're thinking that the mass balance model and its logic would guide the prescriptive filter sets. Like today, you wouldn't need to show a particle count in an operating room, but we're definitely thinking about performance measurement. If you chose to go the route of measurement and validation, those paths should exist in the standard. We kind of talked about this as a future readiness thing. IAQ testing, monitoring is not going to be economically feasible in all parts of a hospital right now, but certainly compared to 10 years ago when the least expensive particle counter on the market was 30 grand, there's a big shift. And that is going to continue. Price points are falling, alternate technologies are coming out, And so whether we like it or not, CMS and some of the AHJs tend to lock in on 170 as an operating standard. So if the performance criteria isn't there, then it isn't easy for them to recognize. So we had a good discussion about what to measure, when to measure, how to measure. We talked about ISO class testing for clean rooms, like protective environments or pharmacies. Pharmacies were already doing them, or operating rooms, obviously operating rooms. And I should say that clean spaces are where where performance is most commonly measured in the international standards. A lot of the international standards have it, but as I said in the beginning, they don't match. None of them match. And so we would need to establish that based on our own rationale. ISO standards are not appropriate for what I'll call the more normally clean spaces. PM 2.5 is a much more likely metric there. And we talked about where that measurement might be. Don't actually have a recommendation on that yet. There is, by the way, an ASHRAE standard for filter challenge testing, and that could be useful in commissioning. And we also did talk about natural ventilation, which could be enabled or disabled based on a particle metric. On the calls, both the owners and the design engineers agreed, by the way, that it isn't very likely that we're going to build that we're going to design or build our systems differently right now or even in the next 5 years. We'll probably keep using a set of standard prescriptions. But the whole idea here is that during commissioning or operations, we see the opportunity for performance alternatives to come into play. And that can become kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As the market learns and people start to implement that stuff, then the standard can grow smarter as it goes. Our final recommendation is to document a rationale and make it available to engineers. As I said, Mike Mattire has, and TC 9.6 has essentially volunteered to look for a vehicle for publishing it. The way we've been running this filter work group kind of puts us in a good position to produce some documentation. Our meetings have been, they start with 10 minutes of technical topic, and then we have open discussion for the rest of the hour, and all the meetings are recorded and then transcribed. Not word for word, but point for point. So those meeting minute files, I mean, we have about 15,000 words. It's a pretty darn good record of the discussions, and it should put us in a pretty good position to write what's necessary. Whatever 170 decides, there will be public scrutiny. Some people are going to say the filter levels are too high. Some will say they're too low. That's likely unavoidable. But we certainly can anticipate those questions because we're having those discussions. So we should be able to hand the committee a list of frequently asked questions and proposed answers that you can simply cut and paste during a review period. And with that, I'd like to open it up for feedback and questions.